Hi, welcome to the County Line. It's May, and this month we're going to celebrate Mother's Day. On May 12th, we should all be celebrating our moms. My mom was a teacher, a nurse, and a nurturer. Most of all, she was a great storyteller. She could come up with a yarn to answer any question a kid could have. She had stories about rabbits and rattlesnakes and rocking chairs and two brothers who could never get married because they developed ugly skin conditions as a result of picking their noses. All these tales were told with such style as to be believable. Every one came with some sort of moral lesson. We lost her to cancer early. She never met her first grandchild. My mother had 4 children. I don't think any of us have been without her. We were all fortunate enough to inherit some of her values, her character, and her quality. And like the furniture which once sat in my childhood home, those values are now showing up in the homes of her grandchildren. It's funny how that works. 50 years ago, I was wrapped up in my first real love affair, and my girlfriend was late. She was a medical student, so I trusted her to handle all the necessary precautions, but, well, Mother Nature. We were in the car one day, sweating this situation out, when a new song played on the radio. Paul Anka was singing about having my baby. Now, I'm no fan of Paul Anka and would have dialed the volume down, except that the lyrics at that particular moment seemed mysteriously relevant. And then came this line: "You could have swept it from your life, but you wouldn't do it." Abortion had been made legal through the Roe decision the previous year. The radio was still playing, but I never heard the rest of the song. The next thing I remember was my girlfriend saying, "That's got to be the stupidest song I ever heard." I wasn't sure what she meant, but I was shocked into considering choices. Didn't have the guts to ask her what she was talking about. Well, she was right, by the way. Even though Having My Baby turned out to be Anka's first #1 hit, CNN voted it one of the 10 dumbest songs ever in 2006. A few months after my girlfriend declared it the stupidest song ever, she came across one that she thought was even dumber just before I left for military service. The song was "Billy, Don't Be a Hero," voted #8 on Rolling Stone magazine readers' poll of the 10 worst songs of the 1970s. But forgive me, this isn't American Top 40. I don't want to leave you hanging. Eventually, nature evened things out with my girlfriend, but quite sadly, our relationship couldn't survive the long separations imposed by my military duties, and almost surprisingly, she had a pretty happy and successful life without me. And still, no lives were lost in the adventure. Swept it from your life. Another great tune from my youth was written by Paul McCartney for the Beatles. As soon as the song came out in 1970, people began associating the lyrics with the most famous mother in Christian history. Paul admitted that the lyrics had come to him in his sleep, but denied any connection with the Blessed Mother Mary. He said that the Mother Mary in his song was his own mom, or I guess mum, as the Brits say. Well, of course she was. The name of that song was "Let It Be." I promised that I'd never quote scripture to you, and I won't, but I'd like to remind you of the story of a girl about 14 and engaged to a somewhat older man. Nothing really unusual in those days, nothing weird. So anyway, she's engaged and likely walking in the city when somebody approaches her and tells her that God is with her and he wants her to have his baby. She must have been terrified. Naturally, she had some questions. Some she didn't ask the stranger, like, what am I supposed to tell my fiance if I come home pregnant because we're not having any, as Mary said, relations? The stranger, who we discover is an angel from God, tells her not to worry. God will take care of everything, if she only says yes. "Let it be done to me according to his word," she answered. "Let it be." And look how great that panned out. When I was in the first grade, I had a bad sore throat. Wasn't really unusual. First time I'd been exposed to that many kids at a public school. It was wintertime in Indiana. It's like living in a petri dish. So I ignored my sore throat until one morning when I had to go to school. And I remember paddling out into the kitchen in my pajamas and telling my mom I just didn't feel up to it that day. She'd heard it before, of course, especially from me. And her almost canned response every time was something like, "Why don't you go back and make your bed and get dressed for school? I'm sure you'll feel better." So I did that. And then I came back out to the kitchen where she was making breakfast, and I said to her, "It didn't work. I don't feel any better. I don't want to go to school." So she slid a bowl of, I don't know, Frosted Flakes or Cheerios or Fruit Loops across the counter and said, "Sit down, eat your breakfast. I'm sure you'll feel better." I don't remember whether I even ate breakfast, but when it came close to the time to make a decision, that make or break, when do I get to go back to bed, or is she going to push me out the door? She said, I told her I wasn't feeling any better, and she said, "Why don't you go get your coat on and walk out to the bus stop? I'm sure you'll feel better when you get to school with your friends." So I did all that, put my coat on, walked a half a block down to Murden Street, and waited with about a dozen other kids in the cold until Walter Corbus showed up in his bus to take us to Wallace School. I still didn't feel any better. My dad always gave me 6 cents to take to school to buy ice cream after lunch, and I remember after lunch that day, my throat was just on fire, and I felt so crampy and awful. I just wanted to take a nap. So I used my 6 cents and bought an ice cream called a push-up. It's like orange and vanilla ice cream wrapped in a toilet paper tube with a stick in the bottom. And you get the ice cream by pushing up on the stick. The ice cream comes out the top. I took it outside at recess after lunch, and I couldn't even eat that. My throat was so tight. Well, by the time school was out, the sun had come out, and even though it was winter, it was a relatively warm afternoon. So all my friends, jumped off the bus, ran home, changed out of their school clothes, and they were in the front yard before I even got to my front door, it seemed like. But I just wasn't feeling the joy, so I walked past my mom and went back to my bedroom and just crawled into the top of the bunk bed that I shared with my brother. Eventually, she came back to check on me, and now she was somewhat alarmed because she could look out the window and see all the neighbor kids outside, and I wasn't very interested. She went to the bathroom and got our mercury thermometer and brought it in and shoved it in my mouth, told me to keep it under my tongue for 2 minutes, and then she went and did something else. When she came back, she pulled the thermometer out, looked at it, studied it for a second, walked over to the window to make sure she was reading it right, then shook it down and stuck it in my mouth again. This time she stayed with me, and when she pulled it out of my mouth, she just told me to get in my pajamas and get in bed, that she'd call me when dinner was ready. Next day, they took me to see our pediatrician, Dr. Reuben Craig, who was a wonderful man. He was very tall and rather lean, as I recall, with a very deep voice. Always had his stethoscopes hung around his neck. He wore one of those long white lab coats that was so big on him that it almost touched his feet, and my dad often joked with him, and it made him look like some sort of a mechanic. But he checked me out and thought I probably had a strep infection, took a strep throat, and swabbed out my throat to make sure that he'd have to send to a lab, and sent me home with a prescription for antibiotics, penicillin in those days. Said he'd let us know. Be no school the next day. or the day after that. The next thing I remember about this adventure was being at the hospital in the afternoon, and my dad was there, which was weird because he hardly ever left his office. And Dr. Craig was there too during the afternoon, when he should have been at his practice on West Superior Street. And I remember that they'd come up with a diagnosis that I had rheumatic fever and that it was spreading through my body pretty quickly. I was very sick. The only way to stop the infection at that point was complete and total bed rest. The more I moved around, the more excited I became, posed a risk of the infection reaching my heart and turn into rheumatic heart disease, which nobody wanted. Dr. Craig wanted to admit me to the hospital. He thought that would be the best avenue to take, where I had no option but to stay in bed. My mother wouldn't hear from any of that. And I remember an argument, my dad being so intimidated by the whole thing that he just kind of stood back and let my doctor and my mother fight it out. She could be a handful when she got properly riled. So I went home, and for the next several months stayed in bed. The only time I was allowed out was to go to the bathroom, and when she changed my sheets. Kids weren't allowed to come in when I was in there. I don't know where my brother was sleeping. My only companion really was a little transistor radio that I remember listening to Arthur Godfrey on almost religiously every day. My first grade teacher, Mrs. Moore, started stopping by to check, and then she started stopping by with assignments, and then she started coming in with tests, and I wasn't doing well scholastically. It was the first grade. I didn't know anything, the first thing about studying. Eventually, she told my mother that she was going to have to set me back. There was just no way she could advance me to second grade because, hell, I didn't know how to do anything. And again, my mother said that was just totally unacceptable. We're not going to have that. So she started working with me on subjects like geography. And my dad, I remember, brought a bunch of flashcards home that he'd bought at the Ben Franklin store for learning math. And my sister Libby, who was a year younger than I was at that time and hadn't even started school, but I think she'd probably read the entire series of Nancy Drew mystery novels, taught me how to read. A gift I absolutely cherish every day that I pick up the written word. And I passed the first grade, graduated. But I was still in bed, and summer had rolled around. And one morning my mom got a phone call from Mrs. Whitson, who lived across the street from us, offering her condolences because her son, Dwayne, who everybody called Butch, had announced at the family dinner table the previous night that Tom was dead. My mom had to laugh. So she asked Mrs. Whitson, she said, "Can you round up some of the neighborhood kids and bring them to our back door at 3 o'clock this afternoon?" Sure enough, at 3 o'clock, Mom let me get out of bed, still in my pajamas. I wanted to get dressed. Who wants, your friends to see you in your pajamas? At least in those days, it was considered unacceptable. Took me to the back door and sat me in a chair, put a blanket over my lap for some reason, even though it was a warm afternoon. I think it was just for dramatic effect. And she looked outside, saw a sufficient crowd had assembled, opened the big door. So now I was separated from my neighborhood friends by a screen, and they were all kind of standing back like they were looking at a lion cage or something. And we talked for maybe 15 minutes, and I don't even remember what they asked. I think a lot of stuff about my illness and how long I'd be sick and when I was going to get well. And after just a short time, Mom said, "Guys, it's time to say goodbye." So one by one, they very orderly formed a line, boys and girls, and they just came up and said goodbye. "Hope you get well soon. Bye. Get you well." Finally, second to the end was Butch from across the street, and I remember he took his hand and reached out and put it on the screen and invited me to touch it. And he showed the other kids that there was nothing to be afraid of and that I was going to be okay. And then he just walked away. Butch and I stayed friends all the way through high school. We were in Boy Scouts together. We were on the swim team together. And then, predictably, we separated. But I'll always cherish that day. The last person in line was Dave Keller, who lived a half a block away. And Dave would later be best man in my wedding. He'd be godfather to my son. But when he stood there in front of that screen door, he just didn't know what to say. He'd always been like a big brother to me, but I don't know what was going through his head. And he finally just nodded and gave me a little wave and said, "See you later," turned and walked away. But you know what? I got over all that. And when I joined the military, I had to fill out a medical questionnaire. And one of the questions involved rheumatic fever. I checked the appropriate box. Sometime later, I'm sitting, in front of this military doctor who's going through my list, asking me questions, talking to me about things, doing 100 things at once because he's got a lot of people waiting to see. And finally, "Oh, you had rheumatic fever?" I confirmed that I had and told him when it was. And he whipped his stethoscope off so fast I thought he was going to hit me with it, and plugged it in his ears, told me to lift up my shirt, started listening to my heart, listened here, listened there, listened here, listened there, had me lay down on a table, listen. He couldn't find a heart murmur. He was shocked that I'd survived rheumatic fever so well and had a healthy heart. I'd repeat that experience years later when I joined the police department and had to take a physical, and even years after that when I was nominated to attend the FBI National Academy. And every day, when I wake up and feel my heart beating, every time I've used that heart to love somebody, I got my mom to thank for it. And so do you. God bless you, everybody. Next week, we're going to do something real fun. Elizabeth Kelly Searsniak, Esquire, is going to be here with some outrageous claims that I think you'll find very entertaining. So, God bless. See you next week.